Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Carl Pauls. This is the Ecomodernist channel live. Um, I'm Carl Pauls. I'm here with Chris Bergan and our special guest, Brad Bergan. Brad is a writer and executive editor in New York. He has bylines in the National Books Critics Circle, the World Economic Forum, NBC News, Business Insider, and elsewhere. Brad is the author of the books Space Race 2.0 and SpaceX, Elon Musk and the Final Frontier. Welcome to the program, Brad.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Hello, Brad.
It was great. We've had a long time relationship with Chris, but you've definitely shown that you've got an interest in some really closely related material. So the space race, the SpaceX progress, this is relating to ecomodernism as our interest in exploring beyond the planet Earth, having that backup to this planetary system we live on. Definitely important for the survival of humanity. What's your take on that, Brad?
Yeah, I think if you go on a long enough timeline, I always keep forgetting the exact timeline of the sun's decay and death. But yeah, if we don't do anything, eventually the Earth or the sun is going to run out of gas, get huge, swallow the Earth. So we're going to die one way or the other if we stay on this planet. And I actually I wrote an investigative article where I talked to several NASA engineers and a few academics way back at my time at Futures, and I think it was 2017, late in the year, where I examined Musk's position that he spoke of in Mexico City like 10 years earlier, that we need to escape Earth or go extinct. He basically said those are our two choices. He's a fan of the former, and that's why basically he created SpaceX, is to get to Mars and to create an extraterrestrial so that we can become a multi-planet species. And in my old investigative piece, I kind of asked, like, are we really in danger of dying of a mass extinction event? So I went through like a handful of different kinds of apocalypses, including asteroid impact, big pandemic, super volcanoes and super solar flares. And I ended up reaching the consensus, or finding the scientific consensus, that it's more super volcanoes. And yes, we definitely need to go, but we don't necessarily need to go to Mars. But that was more NASA's consensus on it. And you can understand that they'd be a little bit more partial to the moon.
How did that pandemic prediction turn out?
And we're all still here. That takes us into contentious areas. Sometimes, some days I'm like, did I really need that booster shot? But actually, no, not to break consensus again, but I never had the booster shot. I just had the original.
Yeah,
So, but we're here,
we are.
unless we're not. And then it's really weird.
Right. No, the different scenarios and the scenarios of how exactly we get from here to the future is pretty much the subject of, you know, of like a lot of our podcast is
Hmm.
how mankind's going to survive. What do we need to do? What is the right sustainable path forward? And not leaving anything off the table. So yeah, even if we succeed in outer space, we need to succeed on Earth. But it's great to have a backup, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And not just in terms of backups of places to places to inhabit, but I think what might be relevant to your channel, so this could be kind of two-way, is we need a backup to just chemical rockets and a backup to like how we develop energy. I'd be interested in hearing what you two think about that. I've written a little bit in years past about companies and ideas to have like fusion powered rockets, in the future tech, or just like nuclear powered bases on Mars. I think even Robert Zubrin's idea, the Mars Direct and Indirect, involved some kind of like nuclear generator on Mars. So I think that those definitely go together, because obviously anyone who knows a little bit about space travel knows that chemical rockets aren't really going to cut it once you go out past Jupiter, and definitely interstellar.
Yeah, I have done quite a bit of interviewing people and listening to people talk about this. Everywhere from local companies to, we had one regional or sort of one ANS conference in Eastern Washington on the subject. So I've learned a surprising amount for someone who just joined the nuclear industry. Basically, I think the place that I'd go is Friends of Fission on YouTube here. I filmed something for oh, I forget his name now. But he used to work with Ultra Safe Nuclear,
Hmm.
uh, and he talks about chemical rockets really are the first gear. They're the first gear of your spaceship. It'll get you out of the atmosphere, and you can't. It's really hard to replace that. You can get off the stop line in second gear with a thermal fission rocket. It's not practical on Earth, obviously, because of fission products. We want to avoid that. And really, we just have so much chemical energy here on Earth that's the magic bullet for getting off of the planet. But yeah, everything around the inner and even outer solar system, we get a lot more from nuclear thermal propulsion. And so this would be heating a noble or any kind of gas to a very high temperature, but probably helium to a very, very high temperature and thrusting that out. And so this is the vision of the future is second gear, zooming around the solar system with some places to refuel with helium, but fewer, far fewer than a chemical rocket would. And then,
Would that still work the same way? Would that still work the same way in terms of deceleration? Like,
yes,
you'd accelerate halfway, decelerate halfway. If you're going way out there, you don't want to zoom past everything.
right, right, absolutely. And of course, fusion being the next step, being the extra solar system mechanism, because you don't know how many decades or centuries it's going to take at this point. And so you need something that you can gather that helium from the interstellar medium. Um, and that's probably the only hope we have of reaching another solar system is using fusion.
Hmm. Oh, cool. There was an article I wrote a while ago, in 2020 for Interesting Engineering, and it was titled "New Revolutionary Spacecraft Might Send Humans to Habitable Exoplanets." And it's very theoretical, but it wasn't nuclear, sadly. I think it was a sail, either a solar sail or which doesn't make sense interstellar wise, but I think it might have been a magnetic sail of some kind, interacting with like interstellar magnetospheres of stars. And apparently, according to the study here, trusting my own journalism, we could reach habitable exoplanets in less than 19 years, going 22% of light speed. And that would be pretty darn cool.
Mhm. Of course,
That
that's assuming that there's a habitable planet on the other end, because that's
right.
a very long way to get there to find out the oasis is dry.
Yeah. I spoke to like maybe a preliminary thing we could do, although this doesn't take any less time, it could take more time. There's a German astrophysicist, can't remember his name right now, but I spoke to him several times around 2020, like right after the pandemic started. And he was the one pushing really hard with an international collaboration on finalizing plans for basically a micro probe with flagship funding. There would be similar technology, but there'd be no deceleration needed. It would literally just zoom out Alpha Centauri or any other nearby system and do like a very up close survey that could include like some visual study as well. All the way from like ones that did have cameras on board and nothing else and a few sensors to like just a tiny little like chip. It would basically take like very passive, use like passive sensors to try to understand what's going on there. Of course, there'd be no return service for that, and you only
Mhm.
have a few seconds. But hey, it worked for New Horizons, although that was a lot bigger and had nuclear power. Cough, cough.
Right. And this is the very common, critique of probes is battery powered probes are disposable. Even if you think you can get solar energy at Mars orbit or closer, it's not going to have a decades long mission cycle like a nuclear probe. But then you've got the countervailing atmospheric conditions where you're just gonna burn up or freeze or break down, and so you don't want to invest a decades long power source into that probe. But yeah, it's certainly, as all engineering goes, a game of balances of costs and optimizations. And speaking of optimizations, why don't you tell us about your book SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the Final Frontier.
Sure. Here it is. I have a few copies here. This is the second book that I put out. It's a page bookmarked because I just grabbed it up, but I can show you like maybe some image, and then I'll describe it. There's a lot of really in-depth engineering. You can't maybe see that well, but here's some, I think, Merlin rockets kind of like broken down. Yeah, so essentially it's a coffee table book with a lot of really in-depth research that tells the story of SpaceX and how Elon Musk came to do it. It starts off with a sort of historical note on the fall of the Berlin Wall and Fukuyama's declaration of the end of history. And I kind of do a parallel between how, like, while it seemed to a lot of people, especially like a mainstream discourse, that history might be over with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, hypothetically over, that like liberalism had won the day. That turned out to not be true, but at the time, from the 90s up until maybe the early 2000s, when we had the last shuttle accident, it seemed like the future of space travel would just be that the solar system and maybe beyond was a big laboratory for NASA and friends. So out of that environment of like extreme optimism and maybe like naive optimism, frankly, how the space program, the NASA space program, and the public's perception of our role in space evolved from this like very high budget, like Apollo, to the space shuttle being extremely over-engineered, but like very impressive, to something that's kind of stripped down for transport. Almost like, this is a really far-reaching analogy, but in the way that, and maybe all your viewers might know this, but in the way that Buddhism is like Hinduism stripped for transport, SpaceX's flight architecture is kind of like big Apollo flagship missions stripped for transport and slightly more business-oriented environment where things, we don't have the same kind of motivations, we don't have the same kind of funding to do it on a federal level. So the book doesn't go into all of that about like Buddhism, Hinduism, and stripped for transport, but it starts with Fukuyama and the end of history and that parallel. And I show how Musk's beginning, I talk about, you know, a little bit of his bio and background, but really get down to the root of the technological innovations like reusability, that NASA had tried that a few times, but the contract ran out. And how SpaceX secured like increasingly more significant launch pads and funding. PayPal, for instance, I'll talk about that, Musk's partnership with Peter Thiel and how that ended out, and how Musk left that company, and then using other companies to help fund SpaceX. And then I dive right into like the progression of the rockets, from the Falcon 1 all the way up to the Falcon 9 and Starship, and all of the tests from the thruster tests, the test fires, to the very dramatic explosions and the successes and failures therein, and where we might go in the future, even after Musk passes on, what will happen to SpaceX. And then there's a little bit of context in terms of like China and other private aerospace companies potentially rising up, and SpaceX's role in redefining space travel is something that is more like corporate and business first, with the science kind of piggybacking on it, which I'm not necessarily a fan of. But in the end, this book deals with the world the way it is, not the way we might wish it to be. And in conjunction with all of that narration, a lot of it, especially, I'd say like the middle third of it, is very technical. It's not too technical for an average reader to read, but you'll see a lot of, velocities, thrust output, and stuff like that. And then, looks like you have a question. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just got to toss in two quick comments. One, a little diversion about Buddhism, just kind of shows that you have a philosophy degree, and it's hard for you to get away from that expanded thinking, which is cool. And but also, your book is available lots of places, both books, but you can also get them digitally and download. And what is an advantage to not having a paper book?
In this sense, I'm a traditionalist. I think that you should have the paper. I mean, most of these images are photos. Some are computer generated because it's like imagining a Mars base and stuff like that. But I mean, mainly my philosophy degree in this sense allows me to tell that the biggest difference between SpaceX and what came before is a lack of unifying purpose. What are we doing it for? ultimately, although like Musk might say some really great, eloquent things about becoming a multi-planet species, what's first and foremost on the day-to-day and almost every launch you'll see is commercial endeavors. So seeing that absence allows you to kind of see, to ask the question and be self-reflective, like what is the space race, the second space race exist for? Who does it serve ultimately? Not to sound cliche, but the hardcover version of the book, there'll be no soft cover. But to be able to hold a book and actually with your own eyes zoom in on this really beautiful photography, I think makes it a lot more worth it to really commit to this than to just get the Kindle, because most of these, even the photos, you might not be able to download them, but seeing them on your screen is something most people can do already. So if you're getting the Kindle, in my opinion, you're selling yourself a bit short. Not that I don't think you should if you want something shipped for transport again, that's a little bit lighter because it's just digital. But I think most of the joy you might get out of it if you get the Kindle version is from my narration, which is a lot of thorough research and yeah, I hope kind of rhythmic and fun to read. But yeah.
Wonderful. So I know that there's been a few of these things that have been very, very popular on Twitter lately, but I'm going to go back to competing in terms of commercial competition. And I know that, way back a decade and a half ago, there were a lot of micro rocketry projects. Like I remember Armadillo Aerospace. I even think that there were a few startups that survived sort of consolidation in that and are trying to do micro launches out of New Zealand or something like that. Is there any space out there for a competition inside the U.S., inside the Western hemisphere, or the Western or global North, the developed, liberalized world?
The Occidental space race,
right.
Which almost sounds like accidental. But like, yeah, I think absolutely, yeah, there's competition right now, but it's about which part of the space launch architecture that it exists. The past several years already, SpaceX has basically become a de facto monopoly when it comes to space travel. Like just this morning, I think they launched Northrop Grumman's Cygnus science refuel mission, so just like resupplying materials for the ISS. But they launched, I think their first launch was actually like a startup that was linked with the university. I might be wrong with this, but just like a little tiny CubeSat. They could go up there and do a little like science experiment in orbit and send the data down before it blows up and whatnot. But all of these budding startups that may one day not only just like have some payload they want to put up there for science or for commercial reasons, they might one day have enough revenue to develop their own flight architecture and run their own missions and operate their own missions instead of just like creating the ships for them, which is what came before like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. All of these companies of like the heyday of NASA's golden age, they would create the rockets, but NASA operated all of the missions, where SpaceX both creates and operates them. So the competition right now is still like in its infancy. I think like if a startup wants to go to space right now and it's new, its best bet is probably just trying to get a contract with SpaceX to lift them up there. But over time, once we're up there, take for instance the ISS, it's going to be deorbited sometime in the 2030s, again, courtesy of SpaceX, according to NASA. They're going to create a special version of its Dragon capsule to pull it down or push it down or decelerate it so that it goes down. But once the ISS is down, like it's not that it's just going to be empty except for China's new space station up there. There are several companies, I think one of them is called Voyager that I spoke to, that are building. Some of them are just like, yeah, they're going to be big luxury hotels that are just like resplendent and maximalist, and Mary Kondo would have a field day criticizing it. But I think that there will be a little bit of a space, not like there'll be hundreds up there at all, but maybe like a handful, half a dozen or something. Companies pushing to have like the most functional or like the best product market fits for the market that will emerge in low Earth orbit of space stations. And then beyond that, mining asteroids, of course, which if you know anything about Bezos's background and his ideas about what should be done with space, he really wants to like mine the crap out of those asteroids and find everything, almost like that movie Don't Look Up, only without the apocalypse. He wants to go mine them all. And when we're out there, if there's just one company out there, then de facto there's no competition. that means you have a problem, because if you have a problem with the boss, how are you going to protest if he just turns off your air? Then it's kind of over at that point. But if there are multiple companies up there, it'll be even in an economic sense and like a hardcore, just like naked capitalist greed sense. It would be in their own self-interest, each company, to basically play fair up in space, because if they're known as the company that is really mean and they're literally a space baron, just like the robber barons in space exploiting workers up there, then no one will want to work with them because the optics will look horrible. Maybe the UN will get involved. Maybe they'll be sanctioned or whatnot. So essentially, I think there'll be some kind of economic federation, not the Star Trek kind, but in a slightly more boring kind, that might even respect some things like the Moon Treaty, those treaties that say like that, all of that like belong to everybody. I hope this answers your question. I'm going a bit on a tangent.
No, it's
yes.
great. It's a good overview. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, there's on your last point, there's a lot of science fiction novels that have a spacious guild that mediate such things. But I wanted to mention too that in the news, well, there's been a lot of news distracting us from space news recently. However, there's currently 2 astronauts on the space station. They're 7 weeks overdue for coming back, thanks to Boeing. So, could you make a little comment on that story, Brad?
I don't know if it's either like cynicism or just myself being busy with other stuff. But I mean, I know they've been up there for a long time, and I know SpaceX is suggested proposing taking missions up there, and it's very embarrassing. I think what I would speak to is that the Schadenfreude is muted, but it's definitely there for Boeing. It's not just first it was the planes, now it's spacecraft. What can't it not do, which is a little bit sad to see. And then you could go looking for reasons, but it probably become very politicized in terms of the conversation. But I mean, right now, I think the astronauts are okay, but like they should be able to get down. Beyond that, I'd have to do a little research. I'm sure that SpaceX will send something up eventually. I don't think it'll be there for years. It's just like kind of inconvenient to get them down right now.
Yeah, I might have misunderstood it, glanced at a couple news articles, but I think the Boeing unit, Starliner, I think it's called, is at the ISS. They're just unsure about it coming back and working correctly. So they're running tests, and right now some people are saying it's 50-50. They'll be able to use the Boeing unit to come back or use the Dragon module to come back. So it's and kind of a spin off of that. I think this is the first time Boeing's used that to send people up. And if this is a failure for them, I have to be reminded of all the successful failures Elon Musk had with his rocketry. So is it really a big failure? I don't know.
Fail harder is what Musk says about his philosophy. 50-50 though, those aren't very good. Those aren't like NASA astronaut level chances that they would ever take. I think they can have just like slight chance of rain and they'll cancel a launch traditionally.
Yeah,
this was Boeing Starliner. It doesn't look great. They don't completely trust it to bring it down right now. So they're checking, as you said.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
and the 50-50 is odds of them which way they will come back, but they're saying it's near 100% chance they will come back safely, one way or the other.
Right. Because we have
I don't think they're going to die.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, competition. Who's going to get them down, you mean?
Oh, yeah. No, I was like they're definitely going to make it down, but the question is who? As long as we have competition, to your point earlier, Brad, that was that's what matters. And so something we recently talked about was Moon, and you mentioned the Moon Treaty. Do you have a perspective? I don't know. This might be out of your wheelhouse. Do you have a perspective on treaties regarding ground transport on the Moon or Mars, and how that might relate to monopoly forces in that market?
By ground transport, do you mean like the transport of materials being mined?
Yeah, like I think that obviously in that low gravity environment, rail is going to be the only way to go, and so we're going to have these dedicated rail shuttles moving cargo around, and then there's a monopoly risk there, like the traditional American rail monopolies. So I'm wondering if you had a perspective on that.
Well, if we get into that, at first, and I'd have to like suggest a hypothetical future where it could change, but with the Artemis program and the plans to build a moon base after the Lunar Gateway, the companies that go up there, that yeah, one might be more responsible for one feature of the like logistical architecture of a moon base, and that could be a monopoly. But I think that more competition, the only competition we'll see might actually be a false competition in the same way that we have a competition that isn't so real on Earth under giant investment firms like BlackRock. So I think that what might happen up there is what might appear as like healthy free market capitalism, like quote unquote healthy, might kind of be just like the same entities extending their arm up there for more business, and all following the same set of rules, unfortunately. But I don't think that that necessarily means it'll only be that way forever. You know, we can look at like other sci-fi stories that look at deep time, like Asimov and psychogeography, for instance. Like they won't necessarily go on forever.
And so in a related vein, and especially relating to these, micro launches and smaller space competition firms, are we going to run in a problem with orbits? And are we going to have orbital permissions and orbital monopolies just to avoid like a Kepler syndrome of people running into one another?
Yeah, I actually have a fact sheet here that I wrote a few weeks ago. I want to mention. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so like space junk is what comes into play here. And as of like a year ago, I think there are estimated 100 million pieces of man-made debris the size of a pencil tip, 30,000 objects in low Earth orbit, objects being like a little bit larger, I don't know, phone size or chair size, and maybe some bigger as well. I think that, I mean, in terms of monopoly, right now, I think that in the next like 30 years, as replacements for ISS go up and commercial activity increases by orders of magnitude in low Earth orbit, there may be some what would you like, toroidal or like spherical shells. I'm trying to think of like calculus now, but like a shell, one aspect of a shell of a sphere of space in low Earth orbit. Or specific orbits might be dedicated to certain companies that have like some big expensive space station. But right now, the biggest no, sorry, let me rephrase that. The danger of space debris, I think, is overstated to an extent. But oh, shoot, I'm kind of losing my train of thought here. Will there be a monopoly in terms of orbital property?
And
I think there can be.
And will it lock out the smaller companies? Will it kill innovation, or will it promote it? Is sort of the question.
It could. I think a lot of SpaceX's technology is not patented. Like I mean, obviously a lot of it is, but I know with like Tesla, he doesn't patent any of the technology for the sort of spirit of humanity advancing technologically. And I think that if enough startups have successful missions that piggyback on SpaceX, eventually they'll be able to move on, especially after Musk himself moves on. SpaceX might go other directions. SpaceX might focus only on like deep space missions to Mars or beyond, whereas like low Earth orbit is open for like other companies to take over. But again, we run into the same problem that the companies that are most in a place to leverage or take advantage of the new opportunities in space are the ones that are already doing very well here on Earth and probably aligned with other companies that work together mutually under investment firms like BlackRock and others to ensure that it stays that way. So, yeah.
And to shift a little bit into fostering more competition, how do you think that our education system is either assisting in promoting more competition in aerospace or is not serving it? Whichever your take it is.
This might be a little out of my wheelhouse, like educating in terms of aerospace or engineering like behind all of this.
Yeah, university programs, incubators, this sort of like if I'm going to draw an analogy, in the early 2000s we had technological incubators coming out of universities for computer startups. And are we likely to see the same sort of opportunities in aerospace, and is it going to actually foster competition? Or and this is a good valid criticism, even if it sounds rote. But is it going to be gobbled up by a mega corporation?
I can't answer that definitively. I think that it's very possible right now. I mean, it's hard to really see any aspect, technological or cultural or political, in the West that isn't in some way, very. And if you can tell, if you know how to look, very strongly reflects the chokehold on which direction we go and what we spend stuff on by the strongest corporate entities in the West under BlackRock. So I think partnership with universities, obviously, it's a good idea to have students have options to find ways into the workforce out of college that will advance the possibility of having more competition in space. So in terms of like my opinion, I think that's a really good idea. But everywhere I go, when I look online and I see like students celebrating getting into aerospace, the ones that celebrate the most are the ones that are either like jumping into NASA or they're jumping into SpaceX. And, you know, good for them. Really happy for them. But then again, like NASA isn't a company at all, and it's not an agency that's necessarily going to have the same role that it used to, instead of as opposed to like now, where it's more of like a supervisory role, and then proposing like new ideas that represent the interests of the American people, ostensibly. So it might help more. I think that, like, hypothetically speaking, if we have a lot more students that are into STEM that want to apply that somehow to the future of space exploration, if we have a new generation that's far more educated in science and emerging technologies across the board, and they're politically involved for those ends, that makes it a lot more likely that we'll have more of a choice in terms of like which companies are calling the shots or collaborating in space instead of just dominating.
Great. Well, you mentioned China at one point earlier, so I wonder if you have any perspective on their ability to compete and their ability to sort of balance out the the liberalized world in terms of exploring space and advancing technologies.
I think they're advancing. Okay, put this way: while they're advancing far more quickly than I think most people expected them to, even just 5 or 10 years ago. A lot of their technology, if you look at their new rockets, they resemble a lot of the stuff we're doing over here. Like you can almost see like a Starship copy in their version of what they want to do up there. But if you zoom out like macro wise, I don't remember the exact figures, but it doesn't even compare in terms of how much money and how many launches SpaceX is putting out there. They still have a long way to go. So I think in terms of the competition, they would be the first one to offer some competition, but not enough competition to where I think SpaceX or the US would feel the need to come to the table on equal grounds and negotiate with China about what's what. Unless we got into like the idea of like militarizing space and Space Force and Russia and all of that, but that's a different subject entirely. That's not economic competition. It's a different kind of competition.
Great. And I guess the only other thing that I have to talk about would be these wonderful optimizations. There's an image floating around Twitter that has the Raptor engine simplification over the 3 generations, and this is this very similar to the images that you have in your book of the previous iterations?
Yeah, those are in there. Unfortunately, they're not in meme form, which I think would be like more effective these days. But yeah, you can see the engine simplifications, and I think I might have seen the same meme where it's like, why isn't software like this? Or it's like it just gets more and more complicated.
Right.
I
like see HR. why isn't nuclear like this? And well, the answer is you just wait. AP1000 is far simpler compared to the second and even early 3rd generation light water reactors. So I think we're getting there, but it is much slower than than aerospace. Aerospace, if you blow up, it's no problem. It's a little different in nuclear.
Yeah, you don't want to blow up when you're doing nuclear. That's failing too hard. You can fail too hard sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, but simplifying, that's the underlying philosophy of the second space race to me. The mission design is to simplify as much as possible. Just utility, utility, utility. We want to use rockets that don't like burn up every time you use them. look at the Apollo. It was really the only reusable part of an Apollo Saturn V rocket fully loaded were the astronauts, if you think about it. Like that's it. Like they don't like refurbish the command capsules and send them up again. It's all kind of spent. We've gone from that all the way to yeah, almost completely reusable entire, like the Starship, the first and second phases of the rockets. Although like we have a fifth launch happening sometime soon. I still think it seems a little crazy to have an idea like we're going to catch it in a net, or it's going to come down in a claw. It's going to like catch the Starship and then like put it on the next rocket. But it's possible. It's like the assembly line is like all of the solar system itself at that point, which is kind of cool in a freaky way. But simplifying is the underlying philosophy for the second space race. That's how you make it cheaper. I've got some figures here, but I don't want to spend some time scrolling around. Oh yeah, here. Starship launches 100 million the most recently, and Apollo is significantly more than that, but SpaceX aims to get it down to 10 million to launch. And you still have a rocket that you can just refurbish and reuse after that. And the astronauts, you can reuse them too, hopefully, unless they've had enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you've brought up a great tangential topic, which is orbital construction and the idea that, hey, we're going to build an engine, in fact, in orbit, and when if you go up, we'll swap that out for your current command capsule, and you will deorbit in a brand new engine. I see that as a real genuine opportunity. It's easier to manufacture in space. It'll probably be faster, cleaner. And there's more resources up in space, easier to move them around. So a win all around. And if we get to that, what a fantastic future to be in. What do you have any perspective on how that might develop?
I think it's already developing. I think it was Musk who said that I think it was for Tesla, first of all, but I think this is from his like first principles perspective, something we should apply. He wants to apply across the board in the next generation of like industrial revolution. But it's not just building the machines and the rockets. You want to build the machines that build the machines. So you go into space and you develop essentially like an assembly line that's automated that can maybe from like materials that are coming in from Earth or materials that are coming in through partnerships with other companies mining asteroids, and you can just break them down and create them on an assembly line. One of the problems, though, to bring us full circle to like chemical rockets is and I'm not a physicist, so I won't go into detail on it, but there's an image computer generated because it hasn't happened yet. But, speaking of having like several ships and one mission architecture, I think the idea for Starship to get to the moon is actually to have several starships because there's not enough fuel to both launch and get to the moon and land on the moon and come back and land on Earth. So the idea is for them, you'd launch in a Starship, you go into space, and then you link up with another Starship that's launched that refuels it so it can go farther. And you get something like this. And there are problems with this because when you're in microgravity, the fluid of the gas or whatever form it's in won't move. Like you can't just pressurize it on Earth with gravity in the same way. So you'd have to like move it so that there's momentum such that the fuel is moving to the right side of the rocket. And there are all kinds of complicated problems with basically kinematics and fluid motion with that proposition. And then there's the idea of like, do we really need to build like, was it like 200 rockets or something a year? And Musk was talking with the Rolling Stone dude like 6 years ago, and they had this interview where the interviewer was like, "That's effing insane." And Musk's like, "Yeah, it is," because he wants to build so many every year. But anyway, it's kind of a smorgasbord of answers. I hope I didn't go too far in a spiral.
Oh, that's great. We're shortchanging you only slightly, but I want to give you some opportunity to engage. I haven't seen questions from Gabe Ignetti yet, so if Gabe, if you're out there, we're ready for anything you've got on either Twitch or YouTube. I've seen Journey Started. Oh, and Journey Started mentions the chopsticks and the launch retrieval systems, both for SpaceX and for China. I think the Chinese system, a pit with a net catching the rocket, that definitely has a lot of benefits in terms of avoiding unnecessary optimizations. So I'm interested in what you think about that.
That much detail on the Chinese mission architectures, again, a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but just doing a little bit of thinking on my own right now, cutting out the need to have like a big claw and catching it, and basically the entire like return journey, you cut out the part after just slowing down. After that, you just have to land in a net. Yeah, that would simplify things a lot. However, not to be any kind of hater, but the proviso is, I think China has shown it has enough trouble keeping rockets from making unscheduled assemblies in like, public residential areas. So I think like, I don't know, right now I think they might need a much larger net in their planning, and then you might see that from space, and it would be kind of silly.
Yeah. You need a net for the accidental launches too.
Yeah, you should distribute those to all of the citizens so that if they see it, they can just break it out really fast. Train for it in school.
And as well, okay, so Journey started in our Twitch chat is mentioning China has already landed on the other side of the moon, and they are running their own space station. It is dominated by the military and the CCP. So we are in fact, coming right up against this international politics, the competition of international relation staring us in the face. And so we badly need competition if that's the way that our economic and political system works, is by competition. I definitely think that's going to be an incentive.
One problem I see there, and I don't want to make this like overthinking this for a quick conversation, but if you think about the way things were in the 60s, which I wasn't there for, but I've had to read about it, in terms of how people treated each other, up until like the early 60s or whatever, and I mentioned this in another talk I did, there was a much stronger sense of like collective identity, whether that was patriotism or whatever. And then with the 60s breaking into a sort of individualism, it was kind of like screw the system and the man and all of that. And what you get out of this is like why would people feel that we have to beat China if we don't have like a collective identity, is what I'm saying here. Mm-hmm. And like, yes, there'll be competition there, like, because would SpaceX and Google and Alphabet and all of these companies under BlackRock want to let China basically call the shots on the moon? No, these companies want to call the shots. They very much like calling the shots where they have dominion. But what does that have to do with, the average Jane or Joe? I'm not so sure there's anything that completely compares to us identifying with like Alphabet's revenue on the moon or right. Bezos's mining profits, unless like maybe we can get a job and it's a good deal, but that's a different subject.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you say a lot about BlackRock, and I know that's an easy target, but
admittedly, yeah,
it is. But essentially, we can't let BlackRock become the perfect enemy, simultaneously weak and strong. We should define what it is that makes BlackRock bad, and that's a pure service of profit. There could be some criticism that there's various regulations or rules or public or political pressure that guide them to do different things. But I generally don't see any regulatory pressure on someone like BlackRock as being a net negative. So any thoughts you have on that?
Only that, like, before we had NASA, which is a federal agency, ostensibly at the beck and call of Congress and Capitol Hill, which ostensibly represents the interest of the people. BlackRock might be subject to some regulatory interests, but they also have, and when I say that, it's really just a placeholder for all the companies that are related to it. And there are too many to list, and I don't know if I want to sit here and just like yell about companies or whatever. I'm not even really being negative about it. It's just a matter of definition. Like, if we, like, who is this we that is going to space? If the people that are going there, or the people that are funding it and control what we do up there, are mostly these corporate entities, and the people don't really have much of a say in what they do, then in what sense is it, in the sense that it's a we, is a little bit open to question. So that's really all I'm saying. And it's not very, like, if you go and you buy something cool, you might really like your Patagonia backpack, but like, whether you identify that the same way that you would feel like proud watching, Buzz Aldrin, or any of the astronauts in the 60s walking or orbiting the moon, I'm not sure it would really compare. That's all I'm saying. I'm not really making judgments here. It's just a matter of like,
it's more of a,
do I feel it?
Yeah. It's more of building building the intentionality of your allegiances. And we used to do that nationalistically, and now we do it under the guise of a brand. And so there are the SpaceX brand fans. There's even Patagonia brand fans, and they love what their founder has done for wilderness spaces, and they all do good stuff, so they buy the gear. And the question, I guess, for everyone out there is then, if you are in service of something like SpaceX or Tesla or Blue Origin, are you the one who's going to escape the planet, or is it just going to be the people investing? And that's for all of us. Chris, go ahead.
I was actually thinking of something that dovetails with what you just said. One of our recent guests talked about having communities living in space or on the moon, and in a way, it sounded to me a little bit like gated communities here on planet Earth, where you have $500,000 homes in a gated community with their own little private security going around on golf carts.
Like
And that
Sarasota.
they would, and they would just decide that they're tired of dealing with social and political constraints or problems here on Earth, and they decide, let's all go to the moon, 1,000 families, and fund it and have hydroponics and bring a few people up for menial tasks, fixing machines, doing wastewater treatment, whatever. But do you have any feeling that some of these wealthy people are leaning that way? I know your first book dealt with you call them the space barons, I believe. And is there any thought among the space barons that, yeah, they'd like to have that community and live there?
I don't think that any of the and I use that phrase in a tacit way just to reference the possibility that it could end up like the robber barons of the 19th century, Carnegie, the people that basically their namesakes run some of the oldest industries in the US and England right now. But I think it's been admitted several times, like even Musk has said, like he won't live to see like, a day on Mars or anything like that. So personally, I don't think any of the so-called space barons have any aspiration to live in space themselves. But right now we already have a lot of, let's say, well-off people building very expensive bunkers in the middle of nowhere. Not to get into like a totally different subject, but there's definitely a desire of the extremely wealthy to cut out all of the noise and danger that they'd rather not live amongst. But what you were saying earlier about like the idea of a bunch of elites deciding that they just want to say, forget Earth, let's go to a community where with like-minded, like you have heavily euphemistic language, like-minded, respectable citizens to go like take care of each other and live like a more enlightened human existence. That reminds me of one of Asimov's books. Again, I don't remember the name of this one, but it happens on a planet called Aurora, where it's just like 2,000 or something people on a very large planet that's mostly run by robots. And like this cop from Earth, which is like all living under domes, it's very claustrophobic, has to go investigate a murder supposedly of a human. I don't think it's iRobot. I think it's a different one. Supposedly by a robot. And it turns out, just like the status, the way they're living on the planet, it is a very gated community. Like they're very elite.
Mm-hmm.
They visit each other sometimes. Everything is automated. They have real nice lives, and there's no crime or anything like that until something goes wrong with a robot. So I think that's very possible. That is already the tendency of the extremely rich happening right now, only on Earth. But I don't think we have the capability to put anyone on like a permanent base, let alone like a nice, luxury gated community for, several decades, at least the end of the century, I think, where you would have people that want to do that. Say Sarasota, some communities there, same kind of people going to the moon or Mars. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that character's name was Daniel, and he had a robot partner.
Was it Daniel or Daniel? I might have been reading it wrong the whole time.
I don't know. I don't recall off the top of my head.
Right. This sort of brings up an interview we did about a month ago with someone talking about living on the moon, and the idea that while we may have these enormous, nationally sponsored or corporate sponsored giant domes or giant underground structures, there is, a common mode failure risk for those, and there is the risk of, one corporation cutting off the air or one nation going to war with another, and we need a path for survival without dependency on these national structures. And so they were envisioning, okay, what would it mean to do small community homesteading on the moon? How would you build up these small structures that can escape from complete dependency on the corporate or the national structures, that can be a backup, that can be free tradespeople living in this either unincorporated or leased territory on the moon, just in case something goes bad. So it's a backup to your back. Have any comments on that?
Mhm.
I mean, I think it's a good idea, kind of DIY space, having your own like independent sort of cowboy frontiersman attitude.
Right.
I think what would have to happen first is the technology would have to be cheap enough that you can do it yourself. Whether it's like respiratory gear, space suits, cheap enough material to build some kind of like habitat wherever you're going or wherever you're going to live. Um, I don't know. It depends on. I could think of like I'm sure you could do a dozen different sci-fi franchises where it's kind of like living by like how much how wild do you want to live is like how far you can go in space, like Firefly, for example, which is kind of like ragtag in space, cowboy
Mhm.
attitude in space, to something else like even Star Wars itself with Han Solo, who's just like a smuggler making his way and all of that. But of course, that would be far more advanced with artificial gravity. But yeah, some kind of homestead where you're just living on your own and making your own way. I think that would be extremely appealing. And to throw it back to my earlier points about like there's no collective identity, an older and much more ingrained strand of American culture identity is the frontier drive, the sort of like going out on your own in this new land and making it your own. That's the promise. Like if things suck in England or the crowded East Coast and New York and all of that, you can just take your family and go out west and find a nice field and settle down and build a cabin. It's all yours. That would be really cool. But again, it would require that the technology become cheap enough and reliable enough. And also back to your conversation about education, it would have to be the means of learning how to do that would have to spread.
Yeah.
Also advance because right now, obviously, nobody's doing that.
Or very few people. Just
Mhm.
that was, I think, our 3 or 4 episodes ago. You'll find a fellow from one of the Scandinavian countries who has basically a small structure up north, and he's experimenting with what are all the different technological readiness levels for, just surviving. How do you bootstrap this kind of endeavor?
Mhm.
And it wouldn't be completely isolated. You would do your own mining or do your own whatever development there is to do in whatever planet we're on in the far future, and bring that back to the national organization, the corporate sponsored organization, and this is sort of, I guess I'm looking for like a way of mediating between the individual and the collectivist and the freedom versus power questions you've put in front of us, which are all incredibly important questions. So I think
That would
it's
also spur
yeah.
not just competition, but like, yeah, you'd have a lot of liberty there. If you had like, yeah, we had all the architecture and infrastructure on the moon to build bases, and sadly, it's all like corporate owned and very centralized and no fun. But then suddenly, people that have worked on homesteading, like the thresholds for bootstrapping your own way out there, going and mining and taking all this material that's hard to get and selling it to national or corporate interests, then they're creating their own independence, and that would spur a whole another generation of competition that you wouldn't necessarily be able to control from centralized Earth because space is very vast and there's a lot of material out there. And if you can do it on your own, catch me if you can. But
Right.
the flip side of that, if you can bootstrap your way in space, not everybody's going to be nice. So then,
Mhm.
pirates, and then it gets fun but scary.
Mhm.
Oh boy. The American dream will live on in space.
Yes.
All the flaws included, I suppose. Can you tell us anything about your books just in general? We are coming to the end of our hour, so thank you so much for your contributions, but I wanted to give you the chance to talk about all of your works and not just SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the Final Frontier.
Yeah, well, in that book, I touch a little bit on the other major players in the second space race, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos. But the earlier book, Space Race 2.0, is much more so cut into thirds. So you get a deeper look at the background of not just Musk, but Bezos, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson, their past history of successes from the Virgin Empire, now Virgin Galactic, everything behind that with Richard Branson, his record-setting flights and adventures in the 80s and 90s, and also Virgin Mobile and all of that. But then Bezos and his beginnings from childhood onward, and how Amazon was founded, like as like the first online bookstore, and just a cool place to like be able to trade literature. And then that turning into a very large empire with the emergence of e-commerce. So you get to see a little bit of their background and also the development of their different methods of getting to space. And they're very different like company and flight architectures, because you have SpaceX, which is like fully loaded. We're going to the Mars as cheap as possible, but as reliably as possible. And you get Bezos, which is a little bit like the gated community vibe. Like we're going to send up a bunch of rich people and their kids to almost space, not quite orbit. And that will fund some things for a while, but then maybe we'll also go to the moon. And there's also a lot of contentious parts that about competing for the Artemis HLS system to land on the moon, which happened earlier this decade between Musk and Bezos and NASA and the lawsuits. And yeah, and then Branson, which obviously is launched from in the atmosphere on basically like sophisticated planes, rockets on them, and the successes and failures of that. And also a little bit of the investigation of if you want to make space travel more democratic and more egalitarian, that is Virgin Galactic's initial goal, is to make it as cheap as a commercial air flight eventually, so that like the everyman or every woman can actually take a trip to space and it won't cost them, the rest of their life. And that's the ultimate goal there. So there's a really big spectrum of like the very richest that want to go and experience fun right now, which would be Bezos, to the more functional, like industry integrated Musk and SpaceX. And then I think I said SpaceX with Bezos, I meant Blue Origin. And then SpaceX, and then Virgin Galactic, which is supposedly going to make it more like, easy to access, easier to afford for the everyman. So that's that book in a nutshell. There's China as well, and some history and a lot of tweets. But yeah, that's the basic comprehensive primer on the second space race, and SpaceX is diving into the de facto leader. And those are my 3 books that I've written.
Wonderful. You can find the Space Race 2.0 and SpaceX, Elon Musk and the Final Frontier, where books are sold, but especially check out that coffee table style version of SpaceX, Elon Musk and the Final Frontier. This has been our time with Brad Bergan. Thanks so much for all your contributions and all of you out on the chats. We've got a pretty good following on X.com today. So thanks everyone there for checking us out as well.
Cool.
And this has been the Ecomodernist channel live. You can find us every 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on youtube.com/@Ecomodernist1. You can find us on Facebook, Ecomodernist Society of North America, on Twitch and other places under my personal tag Soyadel. And you can find us online at esna.earth. You can support our work by contributing on patreon.com. Look for the Ecomodernist channel. And you can join us again every Sunday, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much, everyone, for contributing. And I'm going to find my outro playlist. So there we are. Remember, emissions first, peace and justice will follow.
I want to speak to you about a new organization called the Ecomodernist Society of North America. I'm here because we are in the midst of a potentially monumental ecological crisis. It is only through a new environmentalism 2.0 that progress can be made. We believe that our only hope for human advancement and even human survival is through the exponential advance of science in the service of humanity. Ecomodernism is a new environmental paradigm which looks to reverse the fear of nuclear power and scientific progress in general. Ecology-based modernism is the most direct way to define it. Ecomodernism as a philosophy is described in the Ecomodernist Manifesto. We believe humanity should not be rejecting technological progress, but rather separate our impacts from nature through the responsible use of technology and urbanization. Urbanization is an unstoppable worldwide trend and the best solution to many environmental problems. It offers sustainable development for the human population and is a historic antidote to both deforestation and species extinction as humans move away from using wildlife as their protein source. Vertical, urban, high-rise architecture minimizes the use of land, resources, and energy, enabling walkable cities that facilitates the more efficient use of mass public transit as well. It must be emphasized that our support for technological solutions is definitely not about defending industrial polluters, nor does our defense of technology imply that we just need to sit back and let things take care of themselves.